All right, so this video focuses on Key Concept 2.2. So Key Concept 2.2 states that as the early states and empires grew in number and size and population, they frequently competed for resources and came into conflict with one another. The first subconcept of the first two subconcepts state the number and size of key states and empires grew dramatically as rulers imposed political unity on areas where previously there had been competing states. Empires and states developed new techniques of imperial administration based in part on the success of earlier political forms. So the first supporting evidence would state that there were obviously a number of key states and empires, and the first piece of evidence or supporting evidence would also state that in order to organize their subjects in many regions, the rulers created administrative institutions, including centralized governments, as well as elaborate legal systems and bureaucracies. So what you want to be able to do is provide examples of those centralized governments and bureaucracies. So the first empire that kind of emerges, or not the first, but one of the empires that emerges in period 2 is the Persian Empire, right, or also known as the Achaemenid. Remember that there were two rulers, Cyrus the Great and his son Darius. The Persian Empire was obviously known for their large professional army, right? That means these men were professional soldiers, not volunteers. A large number of military conquests. The Persian Empire was very large, actually, right, extending into almost India, Central Asia, where the Mongols played, Europe, or at least Greece. Parts of the Middle East and North Africa. Remember the Royal Road, right? One of the early, not the Silk Road, but obviously the Royal Road is probably connected to the Silk Road. So an early road that was built by this government. Couriers were used to communicate, almost like a message system. So again, that's all something that's facilitated by this government, right? These are not private companies building these roads. It would be Cyrus the Great that initiates these projects. We also remember that Persia was diverse. You could maintain your local religion. In fact, Cyrus protected and maintained Babylonian religions, especially those statues. He even made offerings to local deities to kind of develop and maintain relationships with the conquered people. He also freed Hebrews who were enslaved by the Babylonians and helped them rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. And remember the Cyrus cylinder, right? That's kind of his legal code. His government policies. These weren't laws, but more how the empire would run, right? But again, you would lump the Cyrus cylinder into that same grouping in terms of codification, the Torah, the edicts of Ashoka, the 12 tables. Darius, like Cyrus, they both believed in the idea of divine right? That kind of connects to the mandate of heaven, right? We're going to learn, at some point, or actually we've already studied, right? The early kings of, not the early kings of Europe, but King Henry and King Louis, right? They too believed in the idea of divine right, that God gave them the power to rule. The Persian Empire was highly centralized. Persepolis was the capital. They would govern regions with satraps. It was a non-Persian, a local ruler who would report back to, Darius, who represented Darius. Part of the bureaucracy included the eyes and ears. Remember, they would spy on the satrap, right? Again, the satrap was the local ruler. You're also going to have tribute, right? Local people are going to pay tribute. And overall, though, the Persian bureaucracy was very efficient. They even had judges for life. So definitely a great example of a highly centralized government that expanded their empire militarily and did allow for local rule, or at least kind of a hands-off policy. But obviously, those satraps did govern and report back to the king. Taxing was very common to fund projects like the Royal Road, the postal system. It's also along this road that you had the caravanserai. caravanserai, I think that's how you pronounce it, inns and markets, right, along those royal roads. And also, Darius promoted a common currency throughout the empire, which not only does it unite the people, but it could also help the economy when there's a single currency, probably in the form of gold or silver. Or bronze, probably not gold or silver, but bronze or copper. We don't have paper money yet. Remember, the Chinese are going to kind of promote that. All right, the Qin Empire, 359. Remember, they govern and base their political governing philosophy on legalism in response to the Warring State period. Again, legalism is this idea that the ruler had to be authoritarian. Legalism did not promote kind of education for all. Again, the educated class, the royal family would kind of govern, and there was very little opportunity for those who were in the lower social classes. As far as legalism goes, law did have to be applied equally, though. So yes, everyone was accountable to the law. Maybe you didn't govern, but the law was applied equally. Laws were often written on bamboo. Penalties for manslaughter were lighter than murder, similar to Hammurabi. Not that that's really important, but remember, their codes are going to be kind of legal codes similar to Hammurabi. There was a clerk, kind of like a judge, that would determine guilt, not more of a jury or an assembly. Subjects could not, though, use the law to challenge the ruler. So, in terms of equality, the ruler did have that, obviously, as a divine leader, did have that protection. At times, though, the laws could be arbitrary and harsh, but they were very detailed. Meritocracy was very common during the Qin dynasty and also the Han dynasty, right? The idea would be to, have the best and brightest. That would eventually lead to a civil service exam, right? So promotion was based on merit, not nobility or hereditary. And that's very unique to China. You're not going to see that in other empires. The Chinese government, whether it was the Han or the Qin or the Song or the Tang, you're going to have lots of offices and a very large bureaucracy. A prime minister would be appointed to kind of do the day-to-day governing, and there would be different departments. An emperor would have someone run the military, the treasury. There would be 40 military commanderies, each with a governor or a military commander. So the regions that were being kind of conquered, again, each region would have a governor and a military commander that would report back to the prime minister and then obviously to the emperor. So there was kind of a ladder, right, in terms of governing. All right, Qin Shi Huangdi, the famous Qin ruler, obviously Qin. He was oppressive, killed rivals, anyone who opposed him, was not a supporter of Confucianism, obviously, if you're, killing rivals. Legalism, I don't think really goes well with Confucianism, and they were obviously, right, they were contrasting philosophies. So it's during his rule that Confucianism is not going to be a central governing philosophy. He abolished local laws. Local leaders had less power under the Qin. He would appoint a magistrate to kind of govern those smaller regions. But we do give him credit for building the early Great Wall of China, canals and roads. So again, there's a great example of the imperial government playing a large role in the empire. Anyone who went against him was usually a slave. Remember, the Chinese did have slaves, not as much as, or not as important. Slavery wasn't as important to the Chinese as it was for the Romans. But India, remember, India is the only really empire that's not going to have, a slave labor force. So a common denominator is slavery pretty much in all of these empires. All right, the Han Dynasty, they are going to combine legalism with Confucianism. They believe the Qin rule was too harsh, too many laws. They're going to continue the idea of meritocracy. They're going to establish an academy to educate and prepare people for the government, and they're going to institute that civil service exam, right? And they needed people to really understand and read the Analects and the classics. The Han Dynasty was one of the larger dynasties. and they too were known for their expansion, but that's going to be a concept down the road in terms of expansion. So again, the Han dynasty is going to differ from the Qin in that they are going to implement more Confucian policies. They're going to rely less on legalism and authoritarianism in a sense, but everything else is going to be pretty much the same in terms of the bureaucracy and the offices. And again, regions are going to be governed by probably a magistrate who represents the prime minister, or at least the emperor. And tribute, right? They're all going to be providing tribute, or all the conquered regions will provide tribute. The Mauryan dynasty, that's the first large Indian dynasty. Remember, that's Ashoka's dynasty. 4th century BCE, meaning the 300s. Again, very centralized. You're going to have different provinces. Each province is going to be ruled by a prince with a council, not necessarily a governor, but it's the same idea, right? Where you're going to have kind of a chain of command, right? The provinces will be organized into districts where there will be a minister or a governor. So again, a very centralized government and then that's the word I was looking for, a chain of command. Large military, heavy taxes on farmers and landowners. And remember, whether it's a tribute or a tax, over time, the landowners are going to get tired of it. They got tired of it in Europe. They got tired of it under Mongol rule. And that's a common denominator. That's going to lead to a lot of conflict between local powers and ruling powers, or the centralized government. And remember, Ashoka was a very effective governor. He too implemented tax collection, and that was used to build wells, improve and fix roads, protect roads, develop irrigation systems. He is going to end slavery, and he's going to call for servants to be treated fairly due to his Buddhist beliefs. He did believe in peace through diplomacy. He became less of a conquering hero and kind of encouraged, again, diplomacy and ambassadorship. He would send ambassadors to Greece and Egypt to improve and promote trade, and he would sponsor non-Buddhist religious observations and pay for the construction of, other religious edifices, again, to kind of promote peace and promote tolerance, and maybe win over a few converts, right? That was kind of the purpose of that at times. That's his Rock and Pillar Edict, right? Like the Hammurabi's Code. It was more about political propaganda, kind of modern day, campaign speeches about how effective he was and his goals and his missions. Reminding citizen of his divine right to rule. More of it outlined his philosophies. It would be like Confucius putting his Analects in the middle of the city. Again, so less rules and regulations and more about political philosophy. But it did unite the empire, like any of these codes did. All right, let's talk about Rome. The political structure of Rome. Remember, early Rome was a republic. A republic is a representative democracy in a sense, where the people, hold most of the power. And that was true early on in the Roman Empire. You had the Senate, right? That was the large ruling body that was made up of patricians, or the land-owning elite, and tribunes. Tribunes, were represented the plebeians, or the lower classes. They did have some veto power, but very often the senators could bribe plebeians to kind of go along with their ideas, whether it was food or sporting events. So early on, the Senate did control most of the power. This is also the social class system. You really had two groups, or at least three groups. You had patricians, plebeians, and then slaves. Plebeians were small farmers, traders, artisans, soldiers, and workers. Eventually, to increase their power, they're going to call for and win citizenship, and also the establishment of an assembly down here, citizen assemblies, the assembly of tribes and centuries. And they're going to kind of increase their power just a bit, and these assemblies are going to begin to pass laws, select court or judges or magistrates, and staff government positions. So as time goes on, I think it's easy to say that the plebeians gain more power. But I think at the end of the day, the patricians and the Senate will always kind of have the most power. Consuls did exist, kind of the president or the leader. They were chosen by the Senate, hence why the Senate did have a lot of power. They consulted with the Senate, not the Assembly, so that's why the Senate had that advantage to sway the consul. There were two of them, one to check the other, and that usually was very difficult. It was hard to get things done. So that's like an early checks and balance system. Don't forget the 12 tables, the early codification for the Romans. It was used to appease the plebeians, kind of establish personal or civil rights or liberties, or maybe not liberties, but basically just to kind of protect their citizenship and their rights. So it outlined punishments or penalties for crimes, rules and regulations for business transactions to kind of protect maybe merchants or traders. But it's an early example of a Bill of Rights. It also helps establish a career path for lawyers, right? When you have a legal system, you need experts. And Cicero is kind of the early legal expert. And we still study his writings in law schools today. The Republic does come to an end when Caesar becomes dictator for life. So he basically seizes power, no pun intended. He's going to rely on the army to secure that title. There's still going to be a Senate, but the Senate will weaken. Those assemblies will see weakened powers. But he's considered a successful ruler because of his reforms, like establishing a modern calendar. He does increase the size of the Senate to give, more patricians a voice at least. He extends citizenship to more people. And he gives land to poor veterans, and he expands the Roman Empire into Greece and Germany. So people really didn't complain. He was getting a lot done and kind of appeasing the people, not screwing it up. He was assassinated because eventually a group of senators believed he was becoming just too powerful, and they feared he would eventually eliminate the Senate altogether. But that would be the end of the Republic. So again, Roman politics is kind of divided between early Republic and then basically a government run by these emperors. Caesar and then obviously Augustus, right? Augustus did not call himself emperor. He called himself the princeps or first citizen. And that's important. He didn't want to look like he was dominating the political spectrum. But he did hold almost all of the power over the empire. But there was a lot of success. During and after his reign, it was known as the Pax Romana period. A lot of peace, a lot of prosperity. What are some of the reforms under him that were accomplished? He did take the power to tax and control the army away from the Senate. I'm not sure that's good or bad, but at least for Rome, that was probably a positive step. He did, believe it was his, right to appoint military leaders and governors. He did that. He did not want local leaders to appoint military leaders because he always feared of challenges, right? So he wanted to make sure that the men who were governing or at least leading those local armies were loyal to him. Other reforms he did improve upward mobility by basically creating a new class, the aristocracy. These are, male property owners, maybe not as much land as the patricians, but they had more land than soldiers and poor farmers. So kind of a middle class, right? A middle class of middle income farmers. And those are the equestrians. And they would basically also have some new positions in government. So some more social mobility. But if you're a worker, a laborer, a soldier, you're probably not going to rise up too quickly or too effectively. A soldier might obtain some land, and that might help him maybe at times, or eventually he becomes an equestrian. But normally your status stayed the same throughout your lifetime. Other reforms included improving infrastructure, obviously with taxes and tribute, roads. The Roman roads would connect to the Silk Roads that would help trade and communication. He built a number of walls and fortresses, and under his rule, citizenship increased to 4 million. Basically, all free men in his empire, regardless of where they lived, Egypt, Germany, became citizens, and that was pretty significant. And the empire reached its largest size under his rule. All right, the Mayans, another central, Mesoamerican group. The Mayans it would be modern Guatemala. Their government was not very centralized. Remember, we always remember these Mesoamerican or South American governments were not centralized. It was a region of city-states, and each city was ruled by a king. So there were a number of Mayan kings, for example. Mayan women could rule if there was no male heir. Wars were very common between city-states, and these city-states expected those conquered people. So again, there's a common denominator throughout these empires, the idea of tribute or tax. And remember, all of these Mesoamerican or Central or South American empires practiced human sacrifice, right? They were polytheistic, and they were very, big believers in sacrificing animals and humans to appease the gods. The rulers also believed in the idea of divine right. All right, so substrand B, would state that imperial governments promoted trade and projected military power over large areas using a variety of techniques, including issuing currencies. Remember Darius. Diplomacy, that's Ashoka. Developing supply lines like the Romans, building fortifications like the Romans, defensive walls and roads, and drawing new groups of military officers and soldiers from local populations or conquered populations, the Romans. So you want to be able to, articulate how these empires expanded, right? So the Hans were known for, they had the largest Chinese dynasty. They were very expansive. They conquered lands, but actually control was very weak at times. Give the Han credit for discovering and growing the Silk Roads. It's not the Qin, it's the Han. They too forced conquered people to pay tribute. They generally believed nomadic people were inferior and needed to submit. There's that kowtow, right? They would also establish garrison towns in conquered lands. Now, the Chinese officials would live separately, so there was probably some resentment building up. Not only were conquered people paying tribute, but perhaps they felt, segregated or, kept out of the loop. The Chinese governments had a lot of influence in Korea and Vietnam, so Korean political structures are going to mirror China more so than, say, Japan, for example. One of the nomadic groups that the Han had a very difficult time with would be the Xiongnu nomads. Right over here, they're the predecessor to the Mongols. They did pay tribute, but as time would go on, they were very effective at defeating the Han in smaller battles. They had superior horsemanship, and they were very quick-footed. So these are the ancestors of the Mongols. So that would make sense that they were great in battle, right? So that would be the Xiongnu nomadic group, 201 to 60 BCE. Alexander the Great, he's known for spreading Greek culture, and he's not going to spread that if he doesn't have a great military, and he did. After his empire was actually split into three regions: Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia. Each region was governed by a ruler, Ptolemy, and Antigonus and Seleucus. You don't have to remember their names, but understand the extent to Alexander's empire. And that's why, you're going to go into Mesopotamia and see Greek influence, or Egypt or Greece. Remember, Alexandria is in Egypt. His empire extended as far east as India. Hence why you're going to see Buddha statues with Greek dress. Roman expansion was also very great. The Roman Empire is still considered the largest empire in history. It would eventually overtake Alexander's empire. They would take over northern Africa, which would be Carthage, formerly the Phoenician Empire. The Punic Wars gave them access to this part of Africa. But at its peak, Rome controlled France, North Africa, Britain, Germany, Egypt, Syria. So a massive empire. They had very effective armies. They had legions or different regiments. That was a military technique that was new and was effective. I think the Mongols would kind of mirror those same military systems as well. They would reward and punish soldiers. So, if you did well, you were rewarded, and if you didn't, you were pretty much going to be, probably executed. So you definitely have to be on your best if you're a Roman soldier. You were highly motivated to just live. Military districts, as I mentioned, or provinces were ruled by a governor, very similar to the Persian satrap. Early on, there was no citizenship, but eventually, under Augustus, everyone in the empire would achieve citizenship. All right, subconcept 3, unique social and economic dimensions developed in these imperial societies in Afro-Eurasia. That would be Africa, Europe, and Asia, and the Americas. Substrand A would basically state that imperial cities served as centers of trade, public performance of religious rituals, and public administration for states and empires. So you want to be able to identify and kind of, basically describe some of these great imperial cities like Persepolis in Persia, Athens in Greece, Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria. These cities are all going to have a lot in common. They're going to have urban centers. They're going to have militaries, walls, infrastructures. They're going to have, obviously, centralized governments are going to be there, lots of jobs, job specialization. So, other than maybe religion, these cities are going to have a lot of similarities. Obviously, you're going to have, not really religion, but I mean, you're going to have, Greek culture in Athens, and obviously in Rome, you're going to have Roman culture. But if you go into Alexandria, you're going to see a lot of remnants of both Greece and Rome. So a lot of synchronicity. All right, another famous city would be Teotihuacan. It's not Mexico City, but it's located near Mexico City, an early Mexican city-state, 150 BCE, and it was a very large, probably the largest urban city in that region at the time. Like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and Chang'an, it had grids, patterns, and streets, bustling markets, almost like a modern city, but definitely remember the grid patterns and streets that were similar to, these other cities. You're going to have temples, pyramids, all of those things that show that there was some kind of, at least, government in place that could employ people to build these structures. All right, let's talk about, the Mayans. You should be familiar with Mayan religious rituals. Remember the sub-concept would be, religious rituals. So, for example, remember the Mayans, they, like all Mesoamerican societies, had human sacrifice and material offerings. But I always remember the Mayans for playing soccer and basketball, right? And if you lost, you were sacrificed. So kind of an interesting little factoid for Mayan religion and Mayan ritual. All right, substrand B states the social structure of empires displayed hierarchies that included cultivators, laborers, slaves, artisans, merchants, elites, or caste groups. So basically, you should be able to summarize the social caste or social class systems of a lot of these civilizations or empires. So what about Persia? Atop, you're going to have your ruling family, your landowners, your educated government workers. On the bottom, you're going to have slaves, and in the middle, you're going to have your farmers, your laborers, and your servants. Very similar to pretty much every other social class system. Persia was also very rigid, like Rome. It was very difficult to go from one level to another, mostly from lower levels to higher levels. Slavery was very extensive in Persia. Don't forget that. Almost equal to Rome. So a great dependency on slavery. The caste system in India, unique in that, right? You might have a similar social class structure to Persia, but obviously, your caste determined, your next life, right? So caste system was more connected to religion than, say, social systems in Persia. So we've kind of talked about that. Remember, the untouchables are at the bottom. The Dalits, they were the ones that were disposing the dead, cleaning the sewers. So that's where you start. And if you perform your dharma, you eventually make it to the Brahmin class. And then if you do that dharma, you will end the cycle of life. Social class in China, similar in that you have your educated groups on top, your landowner aristocracy. sorry, your government officials. Below them, your scholars and soldiers, and then below that, peasants and farmers. Remember, on the bottom, you have your merchants and artisans. How they're actually kind of respected less because of their duty in life, which is to make profit and sell things. Because they don't produce, they're not as highly respected. So they're actually below the peasant class. In Europe, the merchant class is going to be kind of in the middle, above the farming or labor class. Rome, we have the patricians, the plebeians, the equestrians, and then at the bottom we have our slaves. So definitely be able to differentiate between patricians and plebeians. Plebeians did have a voice, though, in government in those assemblies, and that's unique, right? That's unique to the Romans. You're not going to see that, in China. You're not going to see that. You'd see that in Greece, but you're not going to see that. Definitely not in Europe. That's for sure going forward. So the farming class did have some political power. All right, substrand C, imperial societies were looking at a range of methods to maintain the production of food and provide rewards for the loyalty of elites. So what you'd want to be able to articulate or at least explain is the idea of, or the concept of corvée labor. Basically, it's when governments require subjects, usually peasants, to provide labor as a payment of tax. I wouldn't say feudalism, but it's kind of in the same boat, right? You have a duty to the government requires you to work. That's the contribution you make. Kind of reminds me of the Byzantine Empire with their labor system. I forgot what it was called. I just saw it. But when we get to that, I'll kind of stress that. There were a certain number of labor days you had to offer the state. You're going to see that in China. The Qin and the Han utilize corvée labor. I definitely remember this being. I guess we'll get back to when we get to the Byzantine Empire. We'll bring corvée labor back up again. All right, slavery in Rome. Slaves were very common in Rome, usually war captives. They would work in the home. They would work on farms. They were at times educated. They would raise the children of wealthy families, especially Greek slaves who were probably educated. Remember, slaves did revolt, the Spartacus Rebellion around 73 BCE. Important to understand this concept. Slavery was and is never good for an economy. When you are relying on slave labor, or when you're relying on someone to do the work, you're going to get lazy. So, societies that rely on slave labor, especially, think of the South, they're going to be behind the eight ball a little bit. There's going to be a lack of innovation, a lack of technology, a lack of interest in growing an economy or innovating. So that's an important concept to remember. All right, substrand D, patriarchy continued to shape gender and family relations. So definitely be able to understand your gender roles. Women in Greece, at least in Athens, had zero rights. But remember, Spartan women did have more opportunities. They ran households. They had a lot more freedom than most women. They could obtain education, own property, and they too were trained in war and athletics. Persian women had more opportunities than probably most. Women could own and manage property, even earn wages. Divorce was possible, but it was still a patriarchal society, like Sparta. Sparta was still patriarchal as well. So all of these societies are. There's not a single society, at least during these time periods, that were not patriarchal. We're not going to see non-patriarchal societies until the modern era. And you could argue we're still patriarchal today. China, right? Patriarchal, nothing new here. Remember, there are women throughout history that do break the mold. Remember Ban Zhao, she was a poet or a writer. She wrote lessons for women. She was a tutor. She served as an advisor and a regent to the emperor. So, hey, throughout history, we're going to find women that do, challenge patriarchal systems. She did believe, though, that women should be subservient to their husbands, but she did argue that women should at least be literate and should at least play a role in society, aside from just raising families. So I wouldn't call her a feminist by any means, but probably for the time, she was pretty revolutionary. Ban Zhao. India, patriarchal, nothing really new there. Probably one of the most patriarchal societies during this time, probably on the same level as Athenian women. Um, Unselfish devotion to husband. There's an interesting sidebar. When a husband dies, I'd have to go back and remember what it was, but it's kind of an interesting aspect to Indian patriarchy. Maybe you remember. You could refresh me in class. Something happens when a woman, when the husband dies, where the woman has to take her life. Maybe I forget. I'd have to research that. Roman women, before Augustus, they had limited rights. Again, their roles were to educate children. Often they were much younger than husbands. The only women getting an education were wealthy women. After Augustus, though, they're going to see an increase in rights, especially for women who were maybe plebeian. You could divorce. You could begin to own property or even run a business, organize social events. But at the end of the day, women still were not participating in those assemblies in any way or form. And they were also at the, they would receive harsher punishments, especially when it came to adultery. All right, subconcept 4. The Roman, Han, Persian, Byzantine, and Gupta empires encountered political, cultural, and administrative difficulties they could not manage, which eventually led to their decline. So this subconcept focuses on the decline of empires. So you want to be able to explain why empires decline. The substrand states, through massive mobilization of resources, imperial governments generated social tensions. Remember, those taxes and tributes didn't really make people too happy and created economic difficulties by concentrating too much wealth in the hands of elites. Security issues along the frontiers, including the threats of invasions, remember those barbarian invasions, challenged imperial authority. So be able to explain why these empires decline. The Han Empire declined, combination of disease, social class tensions, maybe the Yellow Turban Rebellion, where Wang Mang attempts to redistribute land to peasants. The nobility begins to battle the peasant class. I'll come back to this in a second. All right, sorry about that. My dogs are a little annoying. So again, this is the last major piece to concept 2.2, and you want to be able to explain how these empires decline. So the Han Empire declines as a result of several factors, right? Obviously, disease reduces 1/4 of the population. So those roads that they kind of discovered and developed would eventually lead to their downfall, the Silk Roads. They also had social class tensions, right, that weakened the government and led to unrest. The emperor tries to redistribute land to peasants. The nobility is not too happy. There is a battle between the peasants and the nobles, and that's known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Millions were killed. So when you lose millions of people, that is not going to be very, good for an empire. You're going to be weakened. You're going to be subject to invasion. It's also very costly. You're going to have less, money to protect your empire from invasion. Those invasions by the Xiongnu nomads, those early Mongols, didn't help either. So I would probably argue that it was disease, nomadic invasion, and also social class tensions that brought down the Han Empire. The Romans, very similar, those barbarian invasions. Disease was also a factor that weakened the population. Fewer people equals fewer taxes. Fewer taxes means soldiers don't get paid. Infrastructure is not, maintained. And as a result, Rome was open. And so those Germanic groups like the Huns, the Franks, the Vandals came in, and the Visigoths actually sacked Rome in 410. Here you go. Literally invaded the city of Rome. That's when the Roman Empire's central government moved to Constantinople. So barbarian groups, but it was probably disease that initiates the downfall. And that disease opens Rome up to invasion. There were also some issues economically. The currency of Rome wasn't very valuable. It got to the point where European or Roman merchants couldn't, sell their goods for gold or silver or copper or bronze. So they were only able to get, basically it was a bartering system. So again, less gold and silver and currency coming into your country. And that was a problem. Also, taxes started to be paid in the form of grain. So basically, the Roman treasuries were bankrupt. Because of slavery, there wasn't a lot of agricultural innovation. So as time would go on, food surpluses would decline. Different regions were worse off. And those regions that were struggling with famine were also more open to invasion by those Germanic invaders. So probably go with a bankruptcy or a lack of gold and silver or currency coming into the country, a lack of innovation that led to famine, and obviously disease, which led to Germanic invasion. The Mauryan Empire under Ashoka, 50 years after Ashoka's death, this empire falls. Those regions, those regional governors didn't do a very good job. Armies were not effective. Taxes were not always, taken in. So this is probably not an empire that you would focus on, but like the other empires, basically poor governing. I think that's how I would argue it. Poor governing, poor leadership, and again, that led to invading armies, Asian armies. There were environmental problems due to deforestation, war, drought, that also contributed to the fall of the Mauryan dynasty. The Gupta dynasty, they were actually, the Gupta Empire was overtaken by Huns, the White Huns, a different group of Huns, but from a very similar Germanic region. Gupta rulers were very hands-off, unlike Ashoka. So the Gupta Empire was not as unified. So smaller regions were weaker, and they were the regions that were probably taken over by those Huns. All right, that's it for Key Concept 2.2. I'm going to start a new lecture on Key Concept 2.3. All right, thanks, guys.